During the darkest stretch of Walter Kessler's guardianship, the man who had once controlled $1,280,000,000 was surviving on an allowance of $40 a week, delivered in cash by the assistant of a woman named Diane, still his wife on paper and, by order of the clerk of Superior Court for Mecklenburg County, now his legal guardian. He sat in what used to be his study on Hempstead Place in Myers Park, Charlotte, North Carolina, in a leather chair he apparently used to like, looking at a framed photograph of a man who was supposedly him standing in front of a building that was supposedly his, and he felt nothing. Not sadness, not recognition, nothing at all, the way a stranger feels nothing looking at somebody else's vacation photos. By the time this story ends, that same man will have walked into a Mecklenburg County courtroom and started taking back an empire from the people who tried to bury him alive inside his own mind. But first, you need to understand exactly how a 70-year-old billionaire forgot his entire life, and how the only person who showed up every single day and refused to accept the story everyone else had agreed to tell about him was a 64-year-old housekeeper who was never, not once, mentioned in his will. The room smells like his housekeeper's cooking before it smells like anything else. That's the first thing Alba Reyes noticed about his condition. Back in September, scent came back to him, before names did, before faces did, before the sound of his own children's voices meant anything at all. She stands in the doorway of the study most mornings at 7:15, with a plate of eggs and black beans and a cup of coffee, with too much sugar, because 11 years ago, long before any of this, Walter Kessler told her he liked it that way, and some fragment of habit had survived whatever the crash erased. His cardigan is the same one he wore Tuesday, and the Tuesday before that, nobody irons it anymore, because the household staff was cut from 7 people to 1 by December, and the one who's left doesn't get paid enough to also run a laundry service. She does it anyway, on her own time, folding the collar the way she remembers him liking it, though he's never once thanked her for it, because he doesn't remember there's anything to be thanked for. 3 weeks ago she found the tag from a Brooks Brothers suit still pinned inside his closet, the price never removed, $2,900, bought the month before the crash, and never worn a single time. He wears sweatpants now, the same gray pair, for days out of 7. Nobody in that house has corrected that but her, and she only manages it because she still does his laundry on a Sunday she isn't paid for. Look at him closely enough, and the wreckage is almost elegant, in the way old money decays elegantly even when it's been gutted from the inside. The watch on his wrist is a Patek Philippe worth more than the used Corolla Alba drives to get to him every morning, and he doesn't remember he owns it, doesn't remember it was a gift from his late first wife, doesn't remember what a Patek Philippe even is. A man who once closed a $61 million rail terminal deal over a single lunch now occasionally needs reminding that the mail carrier's name is Denise, and that Tuesday is trash day. He isn't slow. His doctors are careful to say that, repeatedly, in every note filed with the court. He isn't diminished, he is discontinuous, a man whose reel simply stops at a certain frame and starts again decades later, with no bridge in between. What Alba noticed, and what nobody else in that house bothered to notice, was that underneath the discontinuity, something in him was still exactly the man who used to leave the porch light on for late deliveries. He just couldn't remember why he did it. He only knew that he still did. Walter grew up on Eastland Avenue on Charlotte's east side, in a rented duplex his father paid $340 a month for, back when that street still had a textile mill running at the end of it, and you could hear the looms from 3 blocks over on a still evening. His father, Ray Kessler, drove a forklift at that mill's warehouse for 31 years and said the same 5 words to Walter nearly every time the boy complained about anything, whether it was a skin knee or a bad grade. Somebody's always got it heavier. His mother worked the register at a Winn-Dixie on Central Avenue for 2 decades and came home smelling like rotisserie chicken and floor wax. Walter was the first Kessler to finish high school without dropping out to work full-time, which only happened because he lied about his age at 15 and worked Friday and Saturday nights loading trucks at a produce warehouse, without his parents ever fully knowing. He earned a partial scholarship to UNC Charlotte worth $6,200 a year, not nearly enough to cover tuition, room, and board, and spent the next 11 years, after graduation, paying down the rest in installments, the final payment going out 2 months before he took his freight brokerage side hustle, 3 trucks and a fax machine run out of a rented garage bay off Wilkinson Boulevard, and turned it, over the following 2 decades, into Kessler Intermodal, a logistics company that by its 22nd year was moving freight through 11 southeastern ports and employing 4,100 people across 6 states. His business model was almost boringly decent, which is exactly why it worked. He paid drivers 11% above the regional average and self-insured their families against catastrophic injury out of pocket years before it was standard in the industry, on the theory, which turned out to be correct, that a driver who isn't terrified of losing his house over a torn rotator cuff drives more carefully, quits less often, and stays loyal past the point where a competitor's raise would normally pull him away. Forbes put Kessler near the bottom of its annual billionaires list once, a single paragraph buried among 400 other names, and he kept the clipping folded in his desk drawer for 19 years. He married Diane Ferris 14 years ago, for years after his first wife, Carol, died of ovarian cancer at 53. Diane was 40 at the time, sharp, decisive, allergic to sentiment in a way people around Walter described as refreshing back, when refreshing still sounded like a compliment. She signed a prenuptial agreement, without a word of protest, a detail nobody thought hard enough about at the time, because a woman who signs away a claim to $1,280 million without negotiating a single clause is either deeply in love or already planning around the paper entirely. His son from his first marriage, Preston, went into private equity in Charlotte and never once, across 9 years, called his father without eventually asking for something, a reference, an introduction, once, uncomfortably, a bridge loan. His daughter Emma left for Seattle at 23 to build a career in architecture and called twice a year, on his birthday and at Christmas, conversations that rarely ran past 11 minutes. At 69, Walter Kessler appeared on the cover of a regional business quarterly under the headline "The Trucker's Son Who Built an Empire." He kept that clipping too, in the same drawer, and told a reporter once, off the record, that it mattered more to him than any deal he'd ever closed, because his father hadn't lived to see it by 4 years. There's a story people at Kessler Intermodal used to tell about him, the kind that gets repeated at company picnics until nobody remembers if it's exactly true anymore, though the broad shape of it always checks out. A driver named Curtis Boone, 19 years with the company, blew a disc in his back lifting a pallet outside Savannah and was told by 2 different specialists he'd never drive long haul again. Company policy, the policy Walter himself had written, guaranteed 18 months of full pay during rehabilitation regardless of whether the driver ever came back to the wheel. Walter drove down to Savannah himself, unannounced, sat in Curtis's kitchen for 90 minutes, and by the time he left, Curtis had a standing offer to retrain as a dispatcher at full driver scale pay, if the back never fully healed. It never did. Curtis ran the Savannah dispatch desk for the next 11 years and named his second son Walter, a fact Walter Kessler, before the crash, used to bring up at every company holiday party, until people started rolling their eyes good-naturedly and asking him to tell a different story for once. Alba Reyes came to Charlotte from a small town outside Huehuetenango, Guatemala, 19 years ago, 6 months pregnant, with her second child, carrying $340 sewn into the lining of a bag, and a husband, Mateo, who found construction work within 2 weeks of arriving. For years into their life in Charlotte, Mateo fell 2 stories off scaffolding on a job site off South Boulevard and shattered his pelvis in 3 places, and the contractor who'd hired him off the books, cash only, no insurance paperwork, no workers' comp, vanished before the first hospital bill arrived in the mail. That bill came to $61,000. Alba was cleaning rooms at a Days Inn off Interstate 77 at the time, earning $8.25 an hour, and the bank had already sent a second notice on their small mortgaged house near Eastland before, one Tuesday, a certified check arrived at Presbyterian Hospital, addressed directly to the billing office, covering the full balance. No name attached, no note, just a check, routed through a law firm that, when Alba worked up the nerve to call and ask, would not say who had sent it. She never learned the answer for 8 years, not until she found a folded, yellowed receipt from that same law firm tucked into a box of old Kessler intermodal files she'd been asked to shred one afternoon, for years into working as Walter's housekeeper, and recognized the account number from a bill she had kept, out of some instinct she couldn't explain, in the bottom of a dresser drawer for the better part of a decade. She never told him what she'd found. She wasn't sure, back then, whether it was her place to know something like that about the man who signed her paycheck. Mateo died of a sudden heart condition 6 years ago, and Alba stayed on in Charlotte afterward, in a rented room 3 miles from the mansion she would spend the next decade cleaning, without ever fully putting the pieces together, until the day she did, standing alone in a closet, with a shredder running in the next room. What people never ask about a story like Alba's is what happened in the 8 years between the check and the closet, and the answer is, she built something, slowly, out of a debt she didn't know had been forgiven. She took in ironing and alterations on weekends, saved in $100 increments in a coffee can, and by the time her older daughter turned 15, Alba had enough set aside to cover a business license, insurance, and basic equipment for a small cleaning service, 3 employees, herself included, contracting out to offices along South Tryon Street on nights and weekends while she still worked days. She never grew it past 6 employees. She never wanted to. What she wanted, she told her daughter once, was simply to never again be the kind of person a hospital could ruin in a single afternoon. When the housekeeping agency that eventually placed her with the Kessler household called about an opening on Hempstead Place, she almost turned it down. Mansion work paid well, but asked for silence, invisibility, the specific kind of erasure domestic staff learned to perform without being told to, but rent had gone up $200 that month, and she took the interview. Walter didn't conduct it personally. She wouldn't meet him face to face for another 8 months, and when she finally did, refilling a water glass at a dinner party, he thanked her by name on the first try, which nobody else at that table bothered to do, not once, all night. The man who tried to take everything from Walter Kessler carried a law degree from Wake Forest and 34 years of standing as Kessler's personal counsel and, later, as trustee named on nearly every private account Walter owned. Marcus Doyle billed himself as family, and for well over 3 decades, the label fit. He'd stood up at both of Walter's weddings. He'd been in the hospital waiting room the night Preston was born. He drafted the prenuptial agreement that protected Walter's estate down to the comma, and he drafted the layered trust structures that were supposed to protect Walter from exactly the kind of exploitation he was, in fact, already quietly committing. What almost nobody outside a very small circle knew was that 4 years before the crash, Marcus Doyle had begun routing capital out of 3 Kessler-affiliated holding entities into a web of shell companies registered in Wyoming and the Turks and Caicos, disguised as legitimate capital calls for a port expansion joint venture that existed mostly on paper, moving out roughly $9.4 million a year under cover of routine-looking wire authorizations that Walter, trusting the man completely, rarely read past the signature line. Walter trusted Marcus the way you trust a load-bearing wall in a house you've lived in for 20 years. You simply stop checking whether it's still standing, because it always has been, every single day before this one. The mechanics of it were almost insultingly simple once Harold Simmons finally laid them out on a whiteboard. Every quarter, Marcus Doyle would present Walter with a capital call memo for Meridian Port Partners, a joint venture Walter believed was a real, if modest, stake in Caribbean container infrastructure, the kind of side investment a man worth over $1 billion keeps a dozen of, without personally auditing each one. The memo would ask for a transfer, always between $2 million and $2.6 million, always with a plausible one-line justification, dredging permits, a berth extension contractor, insurance on equipment in transit. Walter signed. He'd signed a version of that exact memo 16 times, over 4 years, 4 times a year, right on schedule, never once asking to see the underlying partnership documents, because the man asking was the same man who'd sat in the hospital waiting room the night Preston was born, and you don't audit a man like that. You trust him, the same way you trust the man who built your house not to have skipped the rebar. What Walter never saw was that Meridian Port Partners had no dredging contractor, no berths, no employees beyond a registered agent in Wyoming who filed the paperwork and forwarded the mail. The only thing that ever moved through Meridian was money in one direction into 6 downstream accounts that eventually funded a beachfront lot in Provincials and, later, a South Park condo that had nothing to do with ports at all. The collapse didn't start with Marcus getting caught. It started with a Ford F-250 that ran the red light at the intersection of Providence Road and Sharon Amity Road at 6:52 on a Tuesday evening in September, broadsiding Walter's sedan hard enough to fold the driver's door into the console and send him into a coma that lasted 6 days at Atrium Health's Carolinas Medical Center. When he woke up on the 7th day, he could say his own name, without hesitation and almost nothing else that had happened to him. After roughly the year 2003, a form of retrograde amnesia, his neurologist, in a clipped clinical note that would later become evidence, called unusually clean and unusually complete, which is a careful way of saying it hadn't erased fragments. It had erased 22 years whole, in one motion, like a shelf swept bare. He didn't know Diane's name. He looked at a photograph of Preston at 31 and asked, politely, who the man was. He asked, on 3 separate occasions in his first lucid week, where Carol was, and each time, the person sitting beside him found a different way not to answer. A neuropsychologist named Dr. Renata Okafor spent 40 minutes with him on day 9, running through a standard orientation battery, and wrote in her chart note that Walter could recite his childhood address on Eastland Avenue without hesitation, could name the make and model of his father's forklift, and could not, when asked directly, identify the year, correctly guessing 2004, when it was in fact 22 years later. The patient's autobiographical memory appears intact up to a discrete point, with near total loss thereafter, she wrote, and then, in a line that would matter enormously several months later in a courtroom, added, no evidence of impaired reasoning, judgment, or capacity for new learning. This is memory loss, not cognitive decline. Diane sat in on that session for the first 11 minutes, before stepping out to take a phone call in the hallway. Nobody in the room at the time thought to ask who she was calling or why the call lasted longer than the appointment itself. Diane filed an emergency petition to have Walter adjudicated incompetent 9 days after the crash, while he was still in a step-down unit, physically unable to sign his own discharge paperwork. Marcus Doyle drafted every word of it. The petition described a man incapable of managing his financial affairs and at severe risk of exploitation, language that was, on its face, entirely true, and also precisely calibrated to freeze Walter's operating accounts, suspend his signing authority at Kessler Intermodal, and place control of his combined stock, real estate, and trust holdings, worth a combined $1,280 million, under a single court-supervised guardianship of the estate that Marcus Doyle, not Walter, would co-administer indefinitely. Marcus filed it as an emergency, ex parte motion, attaching only the hospital's initial admission notes rather than Dr. Okafor's fuller evaluation, which would not surface until discovery months later, and asked the court to rule, before Walter, still confined to a step-down unit, could be assigned independent counsel to contest a word of it. The court approved the petition 11 days after Diane filed it, faster than most contested divorces get a first hearing date. Nobody in that courtroom mentioned the $9.4 million a year already quietly missing from 3 separate holding accounts. Nobody thought to ask why the family's own longtime trustee was so eager, so immediate, in volunteering to be named co-guardian of the estate over the exact accounts he'd been draining for 4 years running. Diane moved out of the Hempstead Place house within 6 weeks into a $2.1 million condo in the South Park neighborhood that court filings would later reveal had been purchased 8 months before the crash, not after. She had, in the clinical language attorneys reserve for exactly this kind of thing, already made arrangements. Preston called twice in the first month, then not again, until a subpoena 4 months later required it. Emma, in Seattle, sent a card with a handwritten line, "Thinking of you. Call when you're able," that Walter, unable to place who she was, read 4 times. without understanding why it made him cry. The household staff, a chef, 2 groundskeepers, a driver, and 2 additional housekeepers beyond Alba, were let go inside the first 60 days for cost efficiency during the guardianship review period, according to a memo Marcus Doyle's office circulated on letterhead that still, absurdly, listed Walter as the principal beneficiary of the Kessler trusts. Alba Reyes was the only one Diane didn't bother to fire, mostly because nobody in that house thought a 64-year-old housekeeper mattered enough to remove from the ledger. Walter's allowance, set by the guardianship order, was $40 a week, delivered in cash by Diane's assistant, who left it in an envelope on the kitchen counter, without ever coming in to say hello. The fortune Walter had once controlled now belonged, in every practical sense, to 2 people who had already begun spending against it, a $340,000 retainer paid to a restructuring consultant who turned out to be Marcus Doyle's brother-in-law, and a resort development shell company in the Turks and Caicos with Marcus Doyle listed in filings nobody at that point had reason to check as managing member. Preston's one substantive phone call in that first month lasted 6 minutes and 40 seconds, and Walter, still fuzzy on names, but sharp enough to notice tone, would later describe it as a man reading from a script he hadn't quite memorized. Preston asked how he was feeling. Walter, unable to place who was asking, answered honestly that he wasn't sure. Preston asked, in the same breath, whether Walter remembered where the original stock certificates for 2 subsidiary companies were kept, because it would really help Marcus streamline the transition paperwork. Walter didn't remember and said so, and there was a pause on the line, 3 seconds, maybe 4, before Preston said he had to go. A meeting was starting. He'd call again soon. He did not call again for 4 months, until a subpoena from Grace Whitfield's office required a deposition, at which point his attorney answered every substantive question, with a variation of "my client doesn't recall discussing financial matters" with his father during that period, a sentence that struck more than one person in that room as darkly ironic, given whose memory was actually in question that year. Investigators later concluded Preston hadn't known where the money was actually going, only that Marcus had asked him to help track down old paperwork, and that he hadn't thought hard enough about why. It wasn't a crime. It also wasn't nothing. By November, Walter Kessler's entire daily life had narrowed to a back bedroom of his own house that Diane's decorator had converted into what the paperwork politely called a recovery suite, a room designed, Grace Whitfield would later argue in open court, to house him quietly rather than to bring him back. He walked the same 11-block loop around the Hempstead Place neighborhood every afternoon at 4 o'clock, because a physical therapist had once told him movement helped the healing process, and it was the only decision left in his day that belonged entirely to him. The phone in that room almost never rang. One Tuesday in late November, a boy of about 9, from 2 houses down, walking a scruffy terrier mix, stopped on the sidewalk and asked Walter, a stranger to him in every sense, if he wanted to pet the dog. Walter knelt on the concrete and cried for nearly 4 minutes over an animal named Biscuit, without being able to explain to himself why. That same night he called his younger sister in Gastonia, the only relationship in his life untouched by lawyers or money, because there had simply never been enough of either between them to fight over, and she talked to him for 90 minutes about nothing that mattered and everything that did: their father's forklift, the Winn-Dixie register, the 5 words their dad used to say to anybody who complained. She never made the trip herself. She was caring for her own husband, through a slow decline of his own by then, but she called at least once a week after that, and it was the first hour since the crash that Walter hadn't felt like a liability being managed by people paid to manage him. There was a Tuesday in early December that Alba would later describe, when asked, as the closest thing to a breaking point she had in the whole ordeal, not for Walter, but for herself. She'd driven him, with Brittany Voss's grudging sign-off, to a Harris Teeter on Providence Road, so he could pick out his own groceries for once instead of eating whatever the kitchen had been stocked with. And at the register his guardianship-issued debit card, capped by court order, and flagged for a spending category nobody had bothered to explain to him, was declined in front of 6 people in line. Walter stood there, visibly confused, patting his pockets for a wallet, that no longer functioned the way a wallet used to, and a stranger 3 places back in line. A woman in scrubs, clearly coming off a hospital shift, quietly stepped up and covered the $34.16 difference without being asked, waving off his stammered attempt to get her number so he could pay her back. Alba remembers standing there thinking that a man who had once single-handedly funded a hospital bill for a stranger without ever asking for a name was now, in the eyes of the state of North Carolina, incapable of buying his own groceries, and that the only 2 people in that Harris Teeter who treated him like he still mattered were a stranger in scrubs and a housekeeper who wasn't on the payroll to care. Twice a month, a care coordinator named Brittany Voss, appointed directly by the court to file independent wellness reports, came by, and those visits, Alba noticed, were the only time the house performed anything close to warmth for him. Fresh flowers appeared the morning of, a nicer robe was laid out, and Diane's assistant would arrive early to tidy the recovery suite into something that photographed well. Brittany Voss stayed 18 minutes on average, according to the timestamps on her own reports, and never once asked Walter a question that wasn't on her checklist. On one of those visits, in December, Walter asked her, apropos of nothing, whether it was normal to receive $40 a week, when he was apparently still, according to a folder he'd found in a desk drawer, the majority owner of a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Brittany Voss wrote in her report that the client expressed some confusion regarding financial arrangements, consistent with his diagnosis, checked a box marked satisfactory, and left. Alba read that report over Walter's shoulder 11 weeks later, during discovery, and it was, she said afterward, the closest she ever came to losing her composure in front of a judge. Brittany Voss's file was referred to the state licensing board. That same month, she told investigators she had simply followed the summary Diane's assistant handed her at each visit and had never thought to ask who had written it. Alba started staying later. It began with dinner. She'd cook enough for 2 out of old habit, then admitted to herself it had become deliberate, and it grew, without either of them naming it, into a ritual. Same time, every evening, 6:30, a plate set down across from his 20 minutes of conversation that asked absolutely nothing of him in return. She never once tried to force his memory open by main strength. She simply told him things, the way you tell a child a bedtime story, that happened to be true, what he used to say about his father, what kind of boss he'd been to the drivers who worked the night shift, the way he used to leave the office lights burning until the last truck pulled out, so nobody had to walk to their car in the dark. 3 weeks of that, evening after evening, and one night he told her, unprompted and almost embarrassed, the entire story of the crash and the guardianship and Diane's condo and Preston's long silence, not because he remembered the underlying facts clearly, but because for the first time, since he'd woken up in that hospital bed, someone in the room was listening to him instead of filing paperwork about him. Same time tomorrow, she said, the way she'd said it 11 evenings running by then, and he realized, walking her to the door, that for the first time in months he was actually looking forward to something arriving the next day. Why do you keep coming back? He asked her once, in January, not unkindly, more like a man doing arithmetic that wasn't balancing. Diane doesn't pay you enough for this. Nobody would blame you for leaving. Alba set down the dish towel she was holding and thought about it longer than the question probably deserved. 15 years ago, she finally said, somebody paid a bill I couldn't pay and never told me who. I spent 8 years wondering if I'd ever get to say thank you to the right person. She didn't tell him, not that night, that she already knew the answer to who it was. She wanted him to remember it himself, whole, the way it had actually happened, rather than receive it secondhand from her like one more fact about a life he couldn't verify. So no, she said, it's not about the money. It never was, for either of us, I think. I just don't think you remember that part yet. It was Alba's nephew, Tomas, a second-year law clerk at a small elder law practice near Plaza Midwood, who first looked seriously at the guardianship paperwork Alba had quietly photographed off Walter's desk one afternoon. Copies Marcus Doyle had left lying carelessly in plain sight, confident that nobody left in that house was capable of understanding them, let alone acting on them. Tomas brought the photos to his supervising attorney, a woman named Grace Whitfield, who had spent 11 years prosecuting exactly this category of case for the state, before moving into elder law defense. Because, as she told Walter plainly at their first meeting, guardianship fraud is close to the perfect crime. The victim's own testimony gets disqualified before it's ever heard, on the grounds that he's not competent enough to give it. Grace read the trust documents in silence for nearly 40 minutes. Then she asked Walter a single question. Do you remember signing anything that gave Marcus Doyle authority to co-manage these assets independent of court oversight? Walter didn't remember signing anything at all in any of it. That, Grace told him gently, was precisely the point. The emergency petition had been engineered so that he never got the chance to. She brought in a forensic accountant, a quiet, methodical man named Harold Simmons, who had spent 3 decades untangling shell company fraud for the North Carolina Secretary of State's office, before retiring into private consulting. And within 9 days, Harold had identified the first clear transfer pattern, roughly $9.4 million moving out of Kessler-affiliated accounts every year, for years running. State investigators spent the following weeks confirming the rest, $37.6 million in total, moving through a chain of entities that led, every single time, back to Marcus Doyle's name on a signature line. Grace Whitfield's office was nothing like the glass towers Marcus Doyle worked out of, a converted bungalow on Central Avenue, with a waiting room that doubled as Tomas's desk space, and a coffee maker that only worked if you jiggled the carafe. Walter noticed that the first time he visited, in a way that surprised him, not with the reflexive assessment of a man used to judging offices by their square footage, but with something closer to relief. Nobody there needed him to be impressive. Grace kept a framed motto on her wall, small, unremarkable, that read the paperwork is never the whole story, and she told Walter on his second visit that she'd taken 41 guardianship abuse cases to hearing in 11 years, and 136 of them, and every single one, without exception, had started the same way, a family member or trusted advisor moving fast, while the victim was still too disoriented to ask questions, to lock in control, before anyone else in the picture could. Object. The speed is always the tell, she said. Nobody who's actually protecting you needs 11 days. The Securities Division of the North Carolina Secretary of State's office opened a formal inquiry in early January, and within 3 weeks it had widened into a joint investigation with the Mecklenburg County District Attorney's Office, the FBI, and the United States Attorney's Office for the Western District of North Carolina. Because what Harold Simmons had uncovered wasn't a gray area billing dispute open to interpretation. It was wire fraud and breach of fiduciary duty spanning 6 shell entities across 2 states and 1 Caribbean territory, $37.6 million in clearly identifiable transfers, and a paper trail proving the South Park condo purchase had been partially funded 8 months before the crash, straight out of one of those same shell accounts. Diane's signature appeared on 2 of the wire authorizations, dated 11 months apart, both routed through Marcus Doyle's office. Investigators also checked for any connection between Diane, Marcus Doyle, and the driver of the Ford F-250, and found none. The crash itself had been random. What wasn't random was how quickly the 2 of them moved once it happened. It was, in the end, the memory of a smell that did what 6 weeks of formal cognitive therapy hadn't managed to do at all. Alba was cooking black beans in the small kitchenette at Grace Whitfield's office during a prep session the week before the restoration hearing, the exact recipe, nothing altered, and Walter set down his coffee mid-sentence and said, with total clarity, "You made this the first week we met." Nobody in that room had said a word about timing. The memory came back out of order, first a kitchen, then a dinner party, then Alba's name, whole pieces surfacing, before the facts that connected them did. It was minutes later, when Grace laid the old hospital receipt beside the law firm's record, that Walter understood, whose bill he had actually paid 15 years earlier, long before he had ever met the woman who had been cooking his dinner every night for months. The week that followed brought the rest back in pieces, not in one flood. Grace Whitfield walked him through the trust documents line by line, and each signature loosened something else, a capital call memo here, a board resolution there. Harold Simmons read the wire numbers aloud. and Walter found he could finish some of the sentences before Harold got to them. Dr. Okafor ran a second orientation battery 2 days before the hearing and noted, this time, that Walter could correctly place the year, his own age, and the sitting president, alongside something she flagged as clinically unusual, a rapid, associative return of autobiographical memory cued by sensory triggers, consistent, she wrote, with genuine recovery rather than confabulation. By the morning of February 9th, what Walter carried into court was not one unbroken memory of 22 years. It was a week's worth of recovered fragments, stitched together with Grace's documents and Harold's numbers, into something he could testify to under oath. At the restoration hearing on February 9th, Walter Kessler testified for 2 hours and 11 minutes, laying out dates, account numbers, and conversations from 20 years earlier, with a precision built as much from Grace's files and Harold's numbers as from memory itself, and it made 2 people in that courtroom visibly pale all the same. When he finished, the room went silent for what one courtroom observer later described, oddly specifically, as a long, strange 23 seconds. The court restored Walter to competency. That same afternoon, terminated Diane and Marcus's authority as co-guardians of the estate, and appointed a receiver to oversee the disputed accounts, while the criminal case and the asset recovery moved forward. Marcus Doyle was arrested within the hour in the parking garage beneath his own law office, in front of 2 junior associates who had worked directly under him for 6 years on charges of wire fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and elder financial exploitation. Investigators had secured the warrant the previous evening on the strength of the wire records Harold and the state had confirmed, and had simply been waiting for the hearing to conclude. In his holding cell interview, and later at his arraignment, he told investigators the transfers were advance compensation he'd earned and was rightfully owed for 2 decades of what he called undervalued service, a version of events he appeared, disturbingly, to have talked himself into believing sincerely, even as the wire records made the explanation legally indefensible. Diane was charged separately for the 2 wire authorizations bearing her own signature, and eventually reached a plea agreement that included forfeiture of the South Park condo and a restitution obligation of her own. Somebody's always got it heavier, Walter's father used to say, and when word reached him that Marcus had been let out of his own building in handcuffs, Walter found himself thinking not of that garage, but of a different building entirely, the Kessler intermodal offices, and the lights he used to leave burning there for the night shift drivers. He finally understood how a phrase meant to build humility in a boy could also, in the mouth of a different man, become the exact justification for robbing that boy blind 40 years later. What made Marcus Doyle's collapse different from an ordinary embezzlement case, Grace Whitfield said afterward, was how little he'd actually spent on himself. Investigators found no yacht, no mistress, no gambling debt, just a spreadsheet, recovered from his office laptop, tracking every hour he'd ever billed Walter, over 34 years against what he privately believed his true market value should have been, a number he'd apparently been quietly resenting the gap on for the better part of a decade. He had told himself, evidently for years, before he ever moved a single dollar, that Walter undervalued him, that the friendship was a kind of unpaid labor Walter never fully priced in, and once he'd built that resentment high enough, the fraud stopped feeling like theft to him and started feeling like collection. It's a small, human, entirely unremarkable kind of self-deception, the sort every person recognizes at least a little of in themselves, and that, more than the number on the wire transfers, was what several people in that courtroom found hardest to sit with. Emma flew in from Seattle 4 days after the arrest, and she didn't call ahead. She showed up at the Hempstead Place house on a Saturday morning, sat on the porch steps for nearly 20 minutes before she could make herself knock, and when Walter finally opened the door she said only, "I should have come back in September," and started crying before he could say anything in reply. He didn't ask her to apologize further, and he didn't offer forgiveness in a speech either, because he'd learned enough in the past 5 months to know that speeches were exactly what Diane and Marcus had always been good at. He handed her a rake instead, because Alba had mentioned that morning that the gutters needed clearing before the spring rains came through Myers Park, and the two of them spent that entire Saturday afternoon on a ladder together, mostly in silence, passing tools back and forth. It was that silence, not a single word either of them said, that did the actual work of forgiving. Emma asked him, that same weekend, why he hadn't simply told her not to bother coming back at all, given how long she'd stayed away. Walter thought about it while he coiled the hose. Your grandfather used to say somebody's always got it heavier, he said. I spent 5 months thinking that meant I should be grateful for $40 a week and not complain. I don't think that's what it meant anymore. I think it meant don't assume you know what somebody else is carrying, including your own daughter, 3,000 miles away, who might have been carrying more guilt than I was carrying anger. Emma didn't have a response to that for a while. She just kept raking. Preston did not come. As of this telling, he still hasn't. By April of the following year, once the restitution process was complete, the restructured Kessler Intermodal, freed at last from the receiver's oversight, launched a driver family catastrophic health initiative funded in part by the recovered $37.6 million under a new name, the Reyes Fund, after the woman, who never asked for a single dollar of it, and would have refused the honor outright, if anyone had asked her permission first. It formalized and expanded the catastrophic coverage Walter had always run informally out of his own pocket, extending it for the first time to any uninsured injury affecting a driver's immediate family rather than the driver alone, and writing it permanently into company policy instead of leaving it to one man's discretion. It covers exactly the kind of off-the-books, no-insurance construction injury that had once nearly cost Alba her house 15 years earlier, no employer loophole to slip through, no anonymous check required from a stranger, because it is simply company policy now, written into the handbook every new driver signs. Alba's younger son, Diego, who was studying to become a civil engineer, was awarded the fund's very first full 4-year scholarship, worth $61,000 total, a number Walter insisted on choosing deliberately to match, dollar for dollar, the hospital bill that had started all of this 15 years before, paid forward this time instead of paid back in silence. Alba wasn't there for the announcement. She found out about the fund's name the same way most of the company did, from a memo, because Walter knew perfectly well that if he'd asked her permission first, she would have said no. When he finally told her in person, standing in the kitchen at Hempstead Place on a Thursday evening, she didn't say thank you, and she didn't cry, either. She looked at him for a long moment and said, "You didn't have to make it about me," and he said, "I know. I wanted to anyway. In all the years you've worked in this house, you never once made anything about yourself. Somebody should." He asked her, that same evening, if she would let him add her to his will. She said no, and asked that whatever he had in mind go into the Reyes Fund instead, where it could do more good than her name ever would. Diego's scholarship letter arrived 2 weeks later, and Alba read it standing at the same kitchen counter, where Diane's assistant used to leave $40 in an unmarked envelope, and the distance between those two moments, in that exact spot, was not lost on her. By the time the final restitution order was entered the following spring, investigators and the court-appointed receiver had recovered the full $37.6 million Marcus Doyle had stolen, closing out an asset recovery process that had been underway ever since the court restored Walter to competency back in February. With the receiver's oversight lifted, Walter regained control of the rest of his $1,280 million estate outright, minus what more than a year of legal fees and a paralyzed company had cost him along the way. He sold the Hempstead Place mansion anyway, within the year, and bought a house 900 square feet smaller in the same zip code, on purpose. Standing in that new driveway once, he said the square footage was the only kind of downsizing he had any real interest in explaining to people. Then he said it was enough, and by every account since, he meant it, because for the first time, since the forklift and the Winn-Dixie register and his father's 5 words, wealth had finally stopped being the measure he used to decide who mattered to him. Walter filed for divorce the week the court restored him to competency, and the marriage was formally over long before Diane ever entered her plea. Diane, out on bail awaiting sentencing, moved into a small rental apartment off Wilkinson Boulevard, and has, by every account available, spoken to no one, from her old life since the plea agreement was entered. Preston still hasn't called. Harold Simmons, the forensic accountant, said something in his final deposition that Grace Whitfield later asked permission to quote at a Bar Association panel on elder financial abuse, because it summarized, more cleanly than any statute, what actually happened in that house for 5 months. Fraud like this doesn't usually look like a crime. While it's happening, he said, it looks like paperwork. It looks like people being efficient, being helpful, moving quickly so the family doesn't have to deal with the mess. The victim isn't guarded by a lock or a gun. He's guarded by a story everyone around him agrees to tell, about how confused he is and how lucky he is that someone's handling it for him. The only thing that ever breaks a story like that is someone in the room who refuses to repeat it. Nobody in that panel needed him to say who he meant. Here's the part worth sitting with. It was never the $1,280,000,000 that decided who stayed. Money builds a particular kind of armor, lawyers, prenuptial agreements, guardianship paperwork drafted 11 days before anyone else could object, and nearly every person who wore that armor around Walter Kessler used it, the moment he stopped being useful to them, to walk away clean. Alba Reyes never had any armor at all. She had a schedule, a plate of eggs, with too much sugar in the coffee, and a decision she made new every single evening at 6:30 to show up for a man who, for months on end, could not remember why she mattered to him, only that, somehow, she did. That isn't a smaller kind of loyalty than what $1,280,000,000 can buy. Watching how this story ended, it's hard to argue it isn't the only kind that was ever real. There's an old, slightly worn metaphor about armor that gets used too easily in stories like this one, so it's worth being precise about what it actually means here. The armor Diane and Marcus and, by omission, Preston wore wasn't cruelty exactly. It was insulation, a set of legal and financial structures built, quietly, over years, so that no single moment of loyalty would ever be required of them, so that love could be replaced entirely by paperwork, and nobody would have to feel the absence of it directly. Alba's version of protection ran in the opposite direction. She had no prenup, no trust, no guardianship clause naming her anything at all. She had only the exposure of showing up every evening, with nothing guaranteed in return, and somehow that exposure turned out to be sturdier than every legal instrument Marcus Doyle ever drafted. It's worth asking, honestly, which kind of protection you'd actually want someone building around you, if it ever came down to it, the kind that protects your assets, or the kind that just keeps showing up at 6:30. So here's the question, and it isn't rhetorical. If the people around you had absolutely nothing left to gain from you, no name, no fortune, no memory of what you'd once done for them, who would still show up at 6:30? Tell me in the comments who your Alba is, the person in your life who never needed a reason. And if a story like this one has made you look twice at who's actually standing in your corner, send it to them. Sometimes the people who show up the most consistently are the ones who least often get told it mattered. Subscribe if you want to be here for tomorrow's story about the daughter who almost didn't come back at all.